Is there objection to considering this amendment at this stage?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Arizona.
Mr. Chairman, I would reserve a point of order against the gentleman's amendment. Would like to hear it read or the gentleman explain it, but would reserve the point of order.
The gentleman from Arizona reserves a point of order. The gentleman from Vermont shall have an opportunity to state his case as to why the amendment. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Am I recognized for 5 minutes on my amendment?
Speak to a point of. The House will be in order.
The amendment.
The point of order has been reserved. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment, recognizing that there is a point of order pending against his amendment. The gentleman from Vermont is recognized for 5 minutes, but the gentleman will suspend.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman will suspend. Will the House be in order? Would members on the right please take their conversations off the floor? The gentleman from Vermont is recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is an amendment of enormous consequence, which is supported by people with very different political philosophies. This amendment is co-sponsored by Mr. DeFazio, by Mr. Ney, by Mr. Dellums, by Mr. Stearns, by Mr. Brown, and by Mr. Rohrabacher, by Republicans, Democrats, and Independent, by conservatives and progressives. And what this amendment says is that we believe in democracy, and we believe that legislation passed at the local level, at the state level, and here in the United States Congress should not be overridden by the World Trade Organization. And while we may disagree about this piece of legislation or that piece of legislation, we think that there is something very wrong about our trade policy, whereby this government has abdicated enormous responsibility, and whereby major environmental legislation, legislation dealing with human rights, and other important issues is now threatened and has been threatened by the World Trade Organization. We believe that there is something very wrong when the state of Massachusetts, for example.
The gentleman will suspend. Will the House come to order so the gentleman from Vermont can be heard? He's doing well, but so he can be heard. Gentleman from Vermont.
Thank you very much. We think that there is something wrong when important environmental legislation passed by this Congress is overridden by people in Geneva who meet behind closed doors. We think there's something wrong when legislation passed in the state of Vermont, state of Massachusetts, designed to bring back democracy in Burma, is threatened by the World Trade Organization. Let me take a moment now to yield for 1 minute to my friend from Florida, Mr. Stearns, who has been very active in this issue.
I want to thank my colleague from Vermont, and I want to thank my colleague from Arizona for his kindness and letting at least just talk about it briefly here. Basically, what we're trying to do is give the U.S. Trade Representative more money so he can investigate, look at the U.S. laws, both local and state, that are impacted by the World Trade Organization when it makes decisions, and do they override actually in effect some of these laws at the local and state level. As you know, Mr. Chairman, President Clinton has, since he's taken office, they've negotiated more than 200 trade agreements. And of these 200 trade agreements, only 2 of them have had fast track. This certainly deflates the administration's claim that our nation is in dire need of fast track. So I think the important point here is this amendment that Mr. Sanders from Vermont is offering, and others, including myself, will allow the U.S. Trade Representative to have additional resources to study the impact of the World Trade Trade Organization on the laws, the sovereign laws in the state and the local level, and to get back to Congress to see what impact these trade negotiations are having. And I yield back to Mr. Sanders.
Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have left?
The gentleman from Vermont has 1.5 minutes remaining.
I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio.
We need to understand what is at risk here. The Buy America Act is at risk. The Helms-Burton Act, supported so strongly by some of my colleagues on that side of the aisle, is at risk here. All local state laws which go to local preference in purchasing are at risk here. The sovereignty not only of our nation but of our states and our local communities is at risk. We need this amendment to get additional money to the United States Trade Representative so that they can defend our interests and unearth these ticking time bombs in some of these trade agreements and prevent the overturning of these laws by secret tribunals in Geneva. This amendment should be heard and should be voted on the floor of the House.
Okay, I would yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Matt.
The chair would remind the gentleman from Vermont that you cannot yield blocks of time under the 5-minute rule. You can yield to the gentleman, but it all counts. You cannot yield blocks of time.
30 seconds to Mr. Frank. Yeah.
I thank the gentleman.
I yield to Mr. Frank.
I thank the gentleman. It would seem to me if the chairman of the Rules Committee can object to himself, the gentleman from Vermont should be allowed to be flexible in yielding. I would simply note that the state that I represent passed legislation which said that the state did not wish to do business with people who supported the terribly repressive regime in Burma. And we have since that time had international efforts to stop the state of Massachusetts from deciding how to spend its own dollars in purchases. And that is why I support the effort of the gentleman from Vermont. If we are going to have people use these international bodies to object because we object to oppression, then the time has come to fight back.
The time of the gentleman has expired.
I would ask unanimous consent for 3 additional minutes.
Is there objection?
Mr. Chairman.
You're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I object.
Gentlemen, are you objecting to the additional 3 minutes?
Mr. Chairman, I do object.
The objection is heard.
Mr. Chairman, I was ready to, and I did allow this brief discussion of this, but I do feel compelled to rise to make the point of order against the gentleman's amendment because it seeks to amend a paragraph that in this bill that has already been read under the 5-minute rule. And the House manual states very clearly in Section 872 that when a paragraph or section has been passed, it is not in order to return thereto. Yep. While I am tempted to debate the issues here, I regret that this to say the gentleman's amendment does come too late, and I would ask for a ruling from the chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to speak a point of order.
Vermont like to comment?
Absolutely.
The gentleman from Vermont is recognized on the point of order.
Mr. Chairman, let me explain what happened. As I understand it, last night, a unanimous consent was agreed to by which the Legal Services Amendment would be called up first after the 5 roll call votes which we voted upon earlier today. And that was confirmed to me by everybody. I was here on the floor of the House ready to go, and I was told, no, Legal Services is coming up. I went up to my office. For some reason which I do not understand, and I expect it was inadvertent, the clerk read the first 2 or 3 pages of Title II of the Justice, Commerce, State Appropriation Bill before the Legal Services debate began. And the place in the text in which I had an amendment co-sponsored by Republicans and Democrats alike was therefore passed. Given that reality and my belief that this error was inadvertent, that everyone here believed that Legal Services was going to be debated first, I have asked for and asking now for unanimous consent so that we can debate this very, very important issue which concerns millions of Americans who are deeply concerned about our trade policy.
Inquiry is unanimous consent in order at the time that we are considering a point of order?
The chair will not entertain a unanimous consent, but the gentleman from Vermont certainly has an opportunity to remark on have his remarks and comment on your point of order. The chair is prepared to rule.
Mr. Chairman, on the point of order. On the point of order, Mr. Chairman.
The chair will hear the gentleman from California.
Yes, on the point of order, since the point of order seems intent upon cutting off the rights of Mr. Sanders, I use a point of order to rise in strong support of the gentleman's amendment. Ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Mr. Chairman, may I speak on the
The
point of
chair
order?
is now prepared to rule.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Chairman, I wish to speak to the point of order.
Mr. Chairman, may I Mr. Chairman,
The gentleman may not extend his remarks on the point of order, the gentleman from California. The chair will now rule. Upon his timely reservation of the point of order, the gentleman from Arizona makes the point of order that the amendment proposes to change a portion of the bill already passed in the reading. As indicated on page 680 of the manual, the point of order is well taken, and therefore the point of order is sustained.
Mr. Chairman, I appeal the point of order and would request recorded vote. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I would move to table the appeal of the ruling of the chair.
Mr. Chairman, I have unanimous consent.
Members will suspend.
What?
Okay. I appeal the ruling of the chair, Mr. Chairman.
The question
Mr.
is,
Chairman, I would move to table
Okay.
the appeal.
will the members suspend so that we can proceed? The question is, shall the judgment of the chair be sustained? As many as are in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I
Gentleman
make
from Oregon.
a point of order. The quorum is not quite present, and pending that, I ask for recorded vote. Ask for recorded vote. Make a pending point of order. Quorum.
For a quorum. Does the gentleman withdraw his point of order?
Point of order if a vote is ordered.
The chair, those in favor of a recorded vote will stand and be counted as a sufficient number having arisen. A recorded vote is ordered. Those in favor of sustaining the chair will indicate by voting aye. Those opposed will vote no. This will be a recorded vote, electronic vote, and a 15-minute vote. this vote, the yeas are 231, the nays are 188. The decision of the chair stands as the judgment of the committee. For what purpose the gentleman from Kentucky rise?
Mr. Chairman, could we have order, please?
The committee will be in order. The committee will come to order.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to proceed out of order for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute. Will the committee be in order? The gentlemen, please take their conversations off the floor. The members, please sit down. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, the glue that holds this body together is comity and fairness on both sides of the aisle. The gentleman from Vermont, in my opinion, has a legitimate complaint procedurally about not being able to offer his amendment. In the spirit of fairness and comity, I ask unanimous consent that the gentleman be allowed to offer his amendment and that debate on the amendment be limited to 20 minutes, 10 per side.
Is there objection? Without objection, order. The chair understands that the time limitation would include any amendments thereto. Without objection, that is the order. The chair will rise temporarily to receive a message.
The House is in order. The chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the President of the United States.
Mr. Speaker,
Secretary.
I'm directed by the President of the United States to deliver to the House of Representatives a message in writing.
Thank you.
The chair lays before the House an enrolled bill.
H.R. 2209, an act making appropriations for the legislative branch for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 1998, and for other purposes.
The committee will resume its setting.
The committee will be in order. The gentleman from New York rise.
Speaker, to ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute for the purposes of making an announcement to enlighten the membership about part of next week's schedule.
Objection. Without objection, so ordered. But the gentleman will suspend. Gentleman from New York.
Speaker, the Rules Committee is planning to meet next Monday, September 29th, to grant a rule which may limit the amendments which may be offered to H.R. 1127, the National Monument Fairness Act. That's the Monument Antiquities Act. Any member who wishes to offer an amendment should submit 55 copies and a brief explanation of the amendment by 12 noon on Monday, September 29th, to the Rules Committee at room 312 in the Capitol. H.R. 1127 was ordered reported by the Resources Committee on June 25th, and the report was filed on July 21st. Amendments should be drafted to the text of the bill as reported by the Resources Committee. Members should use the Office of a Legislative Counsel to ensure that their amendments are properly drafted and should check with the Office of the Parliamentarian to be certain their amendments comply with the rules of the House. And, Mr. Speaker, the Rules Committee also is planning to meet the same evening of Monday, September 29th, to grant a rule which may restrict amendments for consideration of H.R. 1370, the Export-Import Bank Reauthorization Bill. Any member contemplating any an amendment should submit 55 copies of the amendment and a brief explanation to the Rules Committee. Amendments should be drafted to the text of the bill, copies of which will be available in the document room. And I thank the membership for their consideration.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Under the previous order of the committee, it is in order to consider amendment number 22. The clerk will designate.
Amendment number 22 offered by Mr. Sanders of Vermont.
The gentleman from Vermont is recognized for 10 minutes, but the gentleman will suspend until we get order in the committee. The gentleman from Arizona will claim 10 minutes in opposition. Will the committee be in order?
All right, Cliff, let me play.
The gentleman from Vermont is recognized for 10 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you very much. And let me, at this point, thank both Mr. Rogers and Mr. Mollahan and members from both sides of the aisle for their commitment to fairness. I think that's the right thing to do, and I appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, this amendment is a tripartisan amendment sponsored by progressives and conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, and an independent. Mr. Chairman, in my view, our current trade policy is a disaster. This year, we're going to run up a $200 billion merchandise trade deficit, the largest in our history, and it's a deficit that's going to cost us millions of decent-paying jobs. But, Mr. Chairman, as serious as the economic implications of our trade policy are, this amendment deals with an issue that is even more important. This amendment deals with democracy and national sovereignty and the right of the American people through their local, state, and nationally elected bodies to make legislation which the American people believe is in their best interests. The members of Congress who are co-sponsoring this legislation have different political points of view. We disagree on everything. But we agree that it is the people of the United States of America who should decide the important issues and not people in the World Trade Organization meeting behind closed doors in Switzerland who should make those decisions and who should override legislation that we pass, that state government passes, that local government passes. Briefly stating, what is some of the legislation that is being threatened, that has been threatened? The WTO, through the urging of Venezuela, forced changes in our Clean Air Act. Mexico forced changes in the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Southeast Asian countries have filed complaints against American restrictions on shrimp. A Massachusetts law promoting democracy in Burma, which has also been passed by many cities all over America, is now being brought before the WTO by the European Union and Japan. And if Massachusetts loses that case, they must take their law off of the books or risk being punished by trade sanctions. So the bottom line is here, that no matter what your political point of view is, I disagree with Helms-Burton, voted against it, want to see it repealed, but I want to see that debate take place here in Congress and not have somebody through the WTO overrule it. So that's the issue. And at that point, I would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Vermont reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 10 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'll begin. Chairman of the Trade Subcommittee, Mr. Crane, for 2 minutes.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. As chairman of the authorizing subcommittee, I object to the policy which motivates the original supporters of the amendment, who feel that additional resources should be provided to the U.S. Trade Representative to identify the effect of the Multilateral Agreement on Investments, or MII, on state and local laws. I don't believe that the funds should be used for this purpose. I'm concerned about the use of these funds for any purpose which might alter the progress of the Multilateral Agreement on Investment. The MAI is the first comprehensive multilateral agreement on investment. However, it's not entirely new. The MAI builds on over 1,000
Suspend. Will the committee please be in order? Gentleman from Illinois.
The MAI builds on over 1,000 bilateral investment treaties already in force around the world. Most of those agreements include investor-to-state dispute settlement procedures. The agreement will not force the U.S. to lower standards, and it will not prevent Congress from regulating the behavior of companies. Nor are we agreeing to a dispute settlement process that can force changes in U.S. law. There will be no loss of sovereignty under the MAI. This amendment would deter progress on developing international rules for investment that mirror our international rules for trade, by which U.S. companies and their workers have benefited from fairness, openness, and transparency. I therefore strongly oppose the amendment offered by Mr. Sanders and urge my colleagues to vote no. And I yield back the balance.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Vermont.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1.5 minutes. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend. Without objection, so ordered. My colleagues, I rise in support of the amendment from Mr. Sanders from Vermont. We have to be honest with the American people. These trade agreements have profound effect on them, and they have a profound effect on local, state, and federal laws. And that's why Mr. Sanders has offered this amendment. There is great concern that the United States laws, which lawmakers in Congress, state legislatures, and localities have worked hard to establish and pass, continue to be overturned by faceless bureaucrats during trade negotiations. Now, these bureaucrats could be in the World Trade Organization, or they could be anywhere. And what can we do as elected representatives of this great nation that will stand up for the laws that are on the books? Many of us would obviously like to stop this constant disregard for U.S. laws, but we are limited in our ability to make such a stand during considerations of appropriations bills, and now we have an opportunity. Make no mistake about it. This vote is a miniature GATT Fast Track 2. What you're saying here today is you think we should, if you vote for this, you're saying we should transfer money out of administration of the Commerce Department into the U.S. Trade Representative. Let him look at the impact of the World Trade Organization on your local state laws. You can't be against that. You have a fiduciary relationship with the people in your district to say, is the World Trade Organization impacting my congressional district? Now, the President of the United States is talking up here on the Hill about pushing fast track. But many of us in this congressional House feel strongly that we need to have an early vote, and I applaud Mr. Sanders for going ahead and putting this in place. Time of the gentleman has expired. Who yields time? Gentleman from Arizona.
Mr. Chairman, I have only one other speaker besides myself. I don't know how many speakers you have over there.
We have many speakers.
Then I would reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Arizona reserves the
How
balance
much time do we have left, Mr. Chairman?
The gentleman from Vermont has 5.5 minutes remaining.
I would yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Brown.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 30 seconds.
I thank the gentleman from Vermont. We in the Congress have a serious responsibility to make sure that the principles of American federalism are not trampled in the rush to approve new trade agreements under fast track. I support the Sanders agreement because we need to send U.S. trade negotiators a clear signal that Congress cares deeply about the fundamental precepts of American sovereignty. We have worked hard to build a consensus around clean air, safe drinking water, and a pure, safe food supply. We shouldn't give it up. Vote yes on the Sanders amendment.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from Vermont.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Ney.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 30 seconds.
I want to thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Chairman, let me just say very quickly that we realize there's a give and take when we're dealing with the world and trade policies, but most of it has been a take from this country. What is going to happen in Switzerland is going to affect township trustees, county commissioners, governors, and citizens of the United States. This is a common sense approach. It's a common sense amendment. All it wants to do is to simply say we should inform people. People have a right to know in this country. We should support the Sanders amendment. It's the right thing to do for America. It's the right thing to do to inform people in our society. Thank you.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from Vermont.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 45 seconds to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 45 seconds.
Mr. Chairman, we need a national economic policy which protects our nation. We need a national economic policy which respects and reestablishes America as a sovereign nation. We need a national economic policy which places the interests of the American people first among all international trade agreements. But the World Trade Organization ruled against U.S. regulations on clean air. U.S. consumer protections, they ruled, violated WTO rules. The WTO ruled against regulations on hormone-treated beef. Now is the time to take a stand on behalf of our rights as a people to self-determination. The WTO does not care about the rights of the American people. The WTO does not care about the rights of our workers, about our environment. It is the American Congress which must stand up for the people. Outside of America, the international community does not care. We, the Congress, must protect we, the people.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman, would the committee be in order? Gentleman from Vermont.
Mr. Chairman, I would inquire as to the amount of time on either side.
The gentleman from Vermont has 3 minutes 45 seconds, and the gentleman from Arizona has 8 minutes.
I would urge the gentleman from Arizona to do his thing.
I'll yield you 30 seconds right now, then. Well, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Moran.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 30 seconds.
I thank the chairman, and I would ask of the chairman, as I read the amendment, this would add $1 million to the United States Trade Representative's office to continue the good work that they are doing in terms of representing us and furthering the globalization of our economy and the progress of our domestic production. So I don't see. I'm baffled by some of the things that are being said, but the amendment itself is only $1 million increase to the U.S. Trade Rep's office. If that's what it does, I don't have a problem with it.
The time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from Vermont.
Would the gentleman from Arizona yield so that I could clarify the position of my friend from Virginia?
Gentleman can certainly clarify it on his own time here.
Okay. I would yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute, but before the gentleman starts, gentleman will suspend. The committee come to order so that the gentleman from California can be heard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman will suspend. Gentleman from California.
I rise in strong support of the Sanders Amendment. There is an alarm bell going off all over the United States, and some people can hear it on the right, and some people can hear it on the left, and some people are ignoring the alarm bell. Other people are trying to set the fire. The bottom line is, ladies and gentlemen, we are being rushed time and again into conceding the authority that was vested in us by the Constitution of the United States to multinational organizations in the name of creating some global trading system, in the name of facilitating global and international commerce. I may have my disagreements with Mr. Kucinich on issues of labor and the environment. But the last thing I want to do is grant authority to some international organization, none of whom will be voted on by the American people, to make these decisions. We will rule the day when we have granted authority to someone who has no obligation to the voters of the United States to make these decisions. Big business today may think they're getting something in the environmental area or the labor area, but all the American people will suffer a loss of freedom if we give it away to these international organizations.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from Vermont.
Mr. Chairman, I would yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio.
Gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 1 minute. The gentleman will suspend. Will the committee be in order? Gentleman from Oregon.
We need to unearth and understand any provisions of any pending trade agreements which might undermine the sovereignty of the United States or our many states or our local governments. According to Renato Ruggiero, Director General of the WTO, in referencing the pending MAI agreement, we are writing the Constitution of a single economy. Now that's the man in charge. He's saying the Constitution of a single economy. That's not our Constitution. It's not compliant with our Constitution or our sovereignty. They have so far challenged the Helms-Burton Act, the Clean Air Act, a Massachusetts law that's promoting democracy in Burma, and restrictions on shrimp, and Buy America provisions and Buy Oregon provisions or Buy California or Buy Arizona provisions will all be held to be non-compliant with this MAI. We're asking for $1 million for the United States Trade Representative to have them fully investigate, unearth, and report to us in the Congress, the representatives of the people of this country, what the reality of these agreements and these threats are, so we may be more fully informed. So I have one agreement with the gentleman from Virginia. We should have this money, and we should know what we're voting on.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Who yields time?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Arizona.
I'll yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Oklahoma.
The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 1 minute.
Ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks, Mr.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to rise and state that even though I agree...
The gentleman will suspend. Would the committee come to order? Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to state, even though I agree with a lot of things that have been said on the other side concerning this amendment, those who are proposing it, I'd like to clarify some matters, though, that I think emotionally that some people get carried away from. I know the gentleman from Ohio stated that it was the WTO that put the embargo against the growth hormone on beef. That's not true. Mr. Chairman, that was in the GATT negotiations where our own USTR allowed that unfair trade barrier to be placed there. And I've been fighting that battle for 7 months. I've been fighting it, pounding the table, becoming obnoxious about it, and whatever, because we've got to have stronger people there negotiating. And the point I want to make, Mr. Chairman, if it hadn't been for the WTO finally recognizing that was an unfair trade practice placed upon our beef producers in this country, and they ruled in our favor. It took over 7 months. But now we're having to go through an appeal. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm thankful that under that circumstance, the WTO was there to help rule against the European Union on this matter, and I think our beef people are going to reap a lot of profit from it.
How much time remains on each side?
Gentleman from Arizona has 6.5 minutes. Gentleman from Vermont has 1 minute 45 seconds. Who yields time?
Mr. Chairman, I would yield myself for 3 minutes.
The gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, as the gentleman from Virginia pointed out, this amendment is very different than the debate that we've been having here tonight. Let's understand what it is and what it's not. It moves $1 million from the Department of Commerce to the U.S. Trade Representative's office, period. That's all it does. Now, the rhetoric is a lot of other stuff going around on it, but it has nothing to do with it. And since we have just gotten an amended budget request from the President on the USTR to add some money, maybe not a bad idea. We will certainly, if this amendment passes, we will certainly use it for that purpose, since that's what USTR needs the money in order to do, to hire some attorneys to carry out their activities here, but not certainly anything dealing with this. I do not have the time to yield. Gentleman has his own time, and he got 5 extra minutes on the earlier motion. Let me just clarify a few other things here about what this is here. The earlier letter that we had from dear colleague letter that we had from some of the sponsors, this talked about this as dealing, of course, with the multilateral agreement on investment. But the fact of the matter is, it really doesn't have anything to talked about the role that the multilateral agreement, or MIA as we'll call it, has with the World Trade Organization, or WTO, but there isn't any link between the MIA and the WTO. To say that there's a link between those two is simply incorrect. The fact is, however, that the new multilateral agreement on investments builds upon 1,000 bilateral agreements investment agreements that are already in force around the world. And all of those have some kind of investor dispute settlement mechanism in them. Most of them are done through the World Bank International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. It's been in existence from 1966. It's one of the primary forces for settling these kinds of disputes. You have to have something to settle disputes when investors get into some kind of a dispute. This is the first comprehensive multilateral investment agreement that we've had, and in that sense, it is new, but it's certainly high time. We have an increasingly complex world of trade out there, an increasingly complex economic situation, and we have to have agreements and we have to have institutions that can deal with this, and that's why we have this multilateral agreement on investments, and that's why we need to have some kind of a mechanism for dealing with these. But let's talk about a little bit about what the WTO has done and what the WTO has not done, because there's a lot of confusion about that. People say that we're giving up our sovereignty to this organization. It is like a lot of other things, and we have it in a whole range of other areas for settling disputes between us when disputes arise. And we have an increasing amount of trade in the world, so we have an increasing amount of disputes in the world. We have fought the first 5 cases that we have taken to the WTO, we have won. We won against Japan on their liquor taxes. We won against Canada on their restrictions on magazines. We won against the European Union on their banana imports. We won against the European Union on their hormone ban. And we won against India on their patent law. As a result of having been able to threaten the actions in the WTO, we've gotten significant settlements in other areas with Korea, with the European Union, with Japan, with Portugal, with Pakistan, with Turkey, with Hungary, a whole variety of
Time of the gentleman has expired.
I yield myself 30 additional seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for a 30
Mr. Chairman,
additional
let me
seconds.
just conclude by saying this. This issue does not have anything to do with the WTO at all. The rhetoric doesn't, and certainly the amendment doesn't. This is policy. It is a major policy. It is the reasons why we do not debate this kind of thing on appropriation bills and should not. It is the kind of thing that needs to be considered very carefully in a very complex proposal in the authorizing committee, and I would urge us to not be misled by the rhetoric that we have had here today. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman, for what purpose, gentleman from Kentucky rise?
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to proceed for 1 minute on the schedule out of order.
Is there objection? Without objection, the gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the chairman. A lot of members are asking about the schedule for the evening. We've been discussing that with leadership on both sides. Here's the intention at the moment as to how to proceed. We would intend that the vote on this matter be rolled and combined with the vote on the next amendment, which I understand is the EDA amendment. If that is so, then members would have roughly an hour between now and when the votes would be taken. At that time, there would be the 2 votes, assumedly, unless there's a motion to rise or some other procedural motion that takes place. That is the intent of leadership at this point in time. I would yield to my colleague.
Gentlemen, would you anticipate that the EDA vote would be taken first and be a 15-minute vote, and that the vote on this amendment would be taken second?
You can do that either way.
No, I think it's that way.
Either way, I have no real preference.
The gentleman from Kentucky has the time.
Well, what we're trying to do is give members
The House will be in order. The gentleman from Kentucky has the time.
I would have no preference. As if anyone has a preference, I'm open.
I do. I would prefer to, if we could vote this after the debate. We'll be finished in a few minutes. Let's vote it. People are here, and then go out for dinner.
I have no problem with that.
Would the gentleman yield? He's saying take the vote, don't roll.
Gentleman from Kentucky has the time.
If the gentleman from Vermont, do I understand you to say that you would prefer not to roll your vote until the EDA vote?
Right. I would prefer to vote it right after the debate, which will end in a few minutes.
Well, I would hope that the gentleman could accommodate members and perhaps combine the 2 votes so that we would have some time off between votes.
Would the chairman yield?
I'll be happy to yield.
For purposes of instructing individuals who are here and those who are not, I would remind the chairman and those members that there may be procedural votes called in between the substantive amendments that may be voted on as well. So I doubt very seriously that there will be an hour worth of time that people would be able to be gone.
Well, I regret that. I would hope that we could proceed with the business of the House and cease the endless motions to rise and the like. I would hope that we could accommodate the members and let everyone have a few minutes of time, perhaps, for other duties.
Is it your... could you tell us how much time remains?
The gentleman from Vermont has 1 minute and 45 seconds, and the gentleman from Arizona has 3 minutes remaining.
Mr. Chairman, we have just one speaker, and we have the right to close, and so I will reserve the balance of my time.
Okay. Gentleman from Vermont.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 45 seconds to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Waters.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for 45 seconds.
Thank you very much, members. The gentleman from Arizona just gave you a preview of his speech on fast track. I don't know what you know about the WTO. I've just spent the last year dealing with the WTO on one of those issues that he just alluded to, the one that had to do with the European Union. In our country, we have the opportunity to go to the meetings, we can go to committee meetings, we can come to this Congress, we can go to our school boards, we can go to our state legislatures. You don't know who's making the decisions at the WTO. You don't know who's on the panel. Nobody's going to send you a notice. Nobody's going to give you a telephone call. You don't have the opportunity to give your point of view. I want to tell you, they just made a decision that's going to cause the drug lords in the Caribbean to take over, where the banana trade has been knocked out by the WTO, and you're going to see that dope and those drugs in the districts that you represent in America. Support this. At least we can get a report on what they're doing, what they're supposed to do, and perhaps we can all get educated about the WTO so that we won't go down the line that we're apparently going down to allow them to make decisions about this country and our laws.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The gentleman from Vermont.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, let me in fact talk about the intent of this amendment, because I'm the author of the amendment, so I know something about its intent. If we had had the ability, we would have brought forth limitation amendments to stop the USTR from doing what they're doing, but we couldn't do that. So the intent here is to transfer $1 million from Commerce to the USTR only for two purposes. First, to do a much better job of informing all members of Congress whether a formal trade complaint is filed or threatened at the WTO or other international bodies, or when entering into new trade agreements which would compel the repeal or changes in our current national, state, local, tribal, territorial, or DC laws. Second, to do a much better job of defending and arguing in support of our existing trade and trade-related laws that are in dispute between the WTO and or other international bodies. This is as far as we could go. I would yield my remaining time to the gentleman from Wisconsin.
The time of the gentleman has
simply
expired.
urge support for the amendment. The public has the right to know this information.
Time of the
It's a
gentleman has
perfectly
expired.
reasonable amendment.
Thank the gentleman.
Gentleman from Arizona.
Mr. Chairman, the gentleman from Vermont may wish his amendment did that, but it doesn't do it. I yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from California, Mr. Dreyer.
Gentleman from California is recognized for the balance of the time.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. I think that many of the arguments that have been made by a number of my friends on both sides of the aisle are very well intentioned, but frankly, they are in large part based on fear. And if one looks at the World Trade Organization, we know what a horrible acronym that is out there. There are many people who believe that the World Trade Organization is going to take over the United States of America. But the fact is, I ask people to name one single instance of where U.S. sovereignty or the sovereignty of any state has been jeopardized. And the fact is, it has not. We also, Mr. Speaker, need to look at the fact that there is no tie whatsoever to the multilateral agreement on investment.
Mr. Chairman, the House is not in order. Mr. Chairman, the House is not in order.
The gentleman is correct. Would the committee please come to order? Gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is, in fact, no tie whatsoever between the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, the MAI, and the WTO. It seems to me that as we look at where we're going, I want as much information out as possible. But the United States of America is the world's only complete superpower, militarily, economically, and geopolitically. I happen to have a great deal of confidence. My California colleague, Ms. Waters, just talked about how closed this is. But the fact is, the United States of America is represented there as the world's preeminent leader. Now, I believe that we need to do everything that we possibly can to break down barriers. I think that members on both sides of this aisle want us to embark on agreements which will reduce the burden of taxes on our working Americans and on the people. No, I will not yield. I have very limited time, and I'm in the midst of my closing remarks. Did the gentleman have a chance to speak?
I did. I'd love to rebut some of the
and
gentleman's remarks.
that's why I've been given the opportunity to close here, and I'd appreciate having the chance to do that. It seems to me, Mr. Speaker, that as we look at where we are headed, this is well-intentioned, but the fact is, I think that it would undermine our attempt to proceed with our attempts in those 1,000 agreements that are in the process of moving ahead so that we can cut that burden. So I urge a no vote on this and hope my colleagues will join in doing that, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. All time has been yielded back. All time has expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Vermont. As many as are in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Ask for recorded vote.
Pursuant to House Resolution 239, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Vermont will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
I have privileged motion at the desk.
Clerk will report the motion.
Mr. Fazio moves that the committee do now rise.
The motion is on the motion that the committee do now rise. As many as are in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes has it. The motion is not agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition? That is the
If they give us the vote, Mr. to the motion. Okay. Parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Speaker.
Unanimous consent.
The gentleman from Vermont is recognized.
I would ask unanimous consent that we be allowed to vote the amendment up or down right now.
No objection.
Is there objection?
I'd withdraw the motion to rise, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, the proceedings on the motion to rise is vacated. The question before the House is the roll call or the vote and the electronic vote request from Vermont. The gentleman from Vermont asked for a recorded vote. Those requesting a recorded vote will stand and be counted. A sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Those in favor of the amendment will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no. Voting will be done by electronic devices, a 15-minute vote.